Welcome to the TomorrowZone Catalyst Podcast, where we explore the future of innovation, leadership, and transformation. I'm your host, Deb Reuben, and today we're diving into what it takes to be a change maker. Today, my guest is Amy Radin, a trailblazer in the world of innovation leadership. She is one of the first corporate chief innovation officers, and her career spans top roles at Citi, American Express, and AXA, where she turned big ideas into business results in industries that are known for being hard to change. And that really hits home for me because a lot of the work that we do is in the finance industry, which doesn't change very fast. Now, Amy, as an author, advisor, and educator, continues to help leaders break through barriers to drive lasting human-centered transformation. Amy, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoy these conversations. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I would love to dive in with you first by just kind of getting a snapshot of your background. And if you could just share a little bit, what are some of the brief highlights along the way that led you to doing this interesting work that you're doing now?
Well, certainly couldn't have foreseen the very beginnings, but I started out, my very first job was working in my dad's corner drugstore in Brooklyn. And I certainly didn't appreciate it at the time, but looking back, when how you serve your customers and how well you understand their needs has a lot to do with putting food on the table.
Yes.
And so being in a family-owned business had a big impact. But I think, fast forward, I landed sort of serendipitously as one of the world's first corporate chief innovation officers, as you said. More recently, I joined Columbia University last year as a lecturer in their MS in tech management program. And if I think about how the dots connect across all the experiences that I've had, whether as a head of marketing, a head of digital, a head of innovation, what I love doing now that taps into all of that experience is helping organizations balance kind of what's technically possible with what both customers and employees will embrace. Because I think that's what really makes the difference in driving great ideas and concepts to impact.
That is so important when I think about where we are in our world today, especially with, just the prevalence of new and more powerful AI tools coming out all the time, like balancing what's possible with technology with what will people actually embrace. That is a huge challenge.
Totally. And I think that, as I reflect upon my work in the corporate world, I've been around for long enough to have been there when mobile was first starting, social media, and even the commercialization of the internet. And, there's a lot of commonality between what's happening today. At the same time, AI is pushing things to a whole different level because those other innovations really forced companies to rethink their processes, their metrics, and everything else. Innovation really hits at people's sense of identity. If AI can do this, what's my value? And so you have to understand both the process and the identity issues, and makes it, as I said, pushes you to a whole new level of how you have to think about implementation than the prior disruptive innovations of the last couple of decades than what they did.
Yeah, I think you bring up such an important point. This is something we're exploring as well, because I'm noticing that this type of innovation is so much different than what we've dealt with in the past. I love the way that you distinguish between the focus on just process improvement to actually understanding the human side of innovation and how this technology is impacting our identity. We're seeing this in the finance industry that we work in. A lot of the work we do at TomorrowZone is in the commercial equipment finance space. And there's a lot of questions about where do I fit in if AI can do so many pieces of what I think of as my job and my role. You've led a lot of innovation in complex and risk-averse spaces. As we think about where things are going for the future, I wonder if you could share a bit of what you have seen, the patterns that you've seen that either accelerate or block innovations from taking hold.
I'm a big believer is that the starting point to any kind of impactful innovation is to create things that solve real human problems, both rational problems and emotional problems. Steve Jobs was often attributed with having said, don't know what they need. Henry Ford said, if people told you what they need, we would have built faster horses. I agree with that. And so you have to be an incredibly astute listener, which also includes listening with your eyes. You have to be an outstanding asker of questions so you can really get to the bottom of, what's paining people. And so I think that's really, really important. And then in the corporate world, building those bridges between the technical teams, business stakeholders, and what customers and users need. So I think those are two really big accelerants. And of course, obviously, the inverse of those will also be blockers. I'll add to that list that two of the biggest blockers that I personally experience and that I see with my clients and with my students is fear of failure. And when resistance is interpreted as opposition and approached as something to be overcome versus understood. And then also, big companies, especially, financial services and insurance, I'm sure you will relate to this given your own clients, have very, let's say, robust, that's a nice way of saying it, hierarchical systems that are designed for control, and with good reason. But that those, when you kind of put a new concept down that chute, your innovations will be, stomped out. And so getting to sort of accepting that innovation requires a different set of processes and metrics and controls versus applying the legacy way. If you're not able to do that, that will be one of your biggest blockers.
Yeah, that's actually something that we see quite often is thinking that you can take the template for managing risk in a finance company, copy and paste it onto innovation initiatives, and magic happens.
Yeah, I often use the copy and paste. I often use the copy and paste metaphor. I recall, when I was at Citi and we were first building, we wanted to acquire card members online, which of course is the way it's done today. But back then, the first instinct of my incredibly intelligent colleagues in risk management was, well, let's just take the paper application and put it online. And oh, by the way, since that doesn't cost us anything, it's free, let's add lots of other fields. And of course, not only does that not work, but you actually drive adverse selection. And so copy and paste will not work.
Oh my God, I'm just laughing here because I have seen this play out over and over and over again. And like the whole thing, back in the day was, oh, let's put our application online. Oh, and make the customer do all of the data entry. Like, okay, yes, because every customer has asked, can I please do more work to get what I need?
Absolutely. Or having people, which this is where our starting point was years ago, scroll through all the terms and conditions versus having a checkbox. But, realize like these little details on implementation, customer experience, how easy it is you're making it for your customer to accept your offer, whether it's financial services or anywhere else, those little details will spell success or failure.
Yes, I was working personally with a finance company just last week, and there was something that I wanted to do. They made it so hard, I abandoned them as an option. It's amazing that still happens in 2025, but we have a lot of work to do.
We do. And then when you ask people, well, who are your favorite, who do you love to do business with? And they'll say Amazon. I will say, well, why? Well, because it's so easy. It's 2 clicks. And I say, okay, let's apply that to our business. And I go, well, we can't do that. And I go, well, what if? Then you have to start asking the what if questions and get people to sort of separate themselves from their assumptions. And I think it's really hard to do that.
It is. It's really hard, I've found, to get finance people to shift from what is thinking to what if thinking. But you have like a whole framework for this. So I want to dive into it. One of the things that I I saw when I was kind of researching your work, you have this model: seek, seed, and scale. First of all, I love the language of that. It sounds like a fruitful model. Can you walk us through that framework for helping teams to move from idea to adoption and kind of get over some of these barriers and patterns that you were talking about?
Yeah, sure. And this is what I wrote my book about. And I really sat down when I wrote the book, The Changemaker's Playbook. I called it originally the download for my brain. Like, what did I experience? Like, how can I really help other innovators? And it's interesting that even though the book was published 6 years ago, I'd say it's relevant plus. So seeking is, and I mentioned this before, all about discovering real problems that matter by becoming great at gathering insights. So I said, listening with your eyes, not just your ears, knowing how to ask great questions, going to the non-obvious sources. And I think focus groups are a weaker and weaker way to gather insight. Or when people say to me, oh, we'll do a survey. And I'm like, no, I have much more a believer in great qualitative these days than in big surveys, which have all kinds of skews and issues with them, as I'm sure you well know.
Before you move on to the next piece of that, can I ask you something?
Sure.
Can you just share what that means to you to listen with your eyes, not just your ears?
Sure. And I'll give you a great example of something that we did years ago during the financial crisis. When I was the chief innovation officer at E-Trade, we were doing in-home interviews with a very small sample of target investors. And we went, and of course, my colleagues didn't want to come to any of the interviews. They thought it was like really spooky that we were going to people's homes. And we went to visit this couple in Boston, and we asked them to show us the financial area of their home to understand how they were paying their bills. And this couple had a bag of unpaid bills in a shopping bag in the corner of their dining room. Now, that tells you so much and opens up so many other areas for discussion than, if you were sitting at a focus group facility or doing a telephone call or asking for a survey response. There is no chance you would get that insight and have the opportunity to unpack it.
Yeah.
So that one really stays in my mind as a very visceral example.
That is a really powerful example, because how often do you actually get to observe your customer in their natural habitat?
Not often, but it's, obviously you have to do it. And then you have to, there's a structured way to do it, and you have to recruit carefully. You have to set it up right. Going into people's homes or into their place of business. I'll tell you another example. When I was working for AXA, I went around one day on calling on financial advisors with one of our salespeople. And we went into somebody's office, and they had on their windowsill mountains and mountains of all of the really expensive marketing materials they were getting from different product manufacturers. And, in our organization, the product heads were pushing my team to make more of those brochures. And it was so obvious that the financial advisors did not need another brochure. They weren't reading any of them. So, another example. So I think getting into people's own place, whether it's their home or their office, how they live their lives, is going to be much more helpful oftentimes than doing a big survey.
I love that, because it all goes back to really, really understanding your customer, just like you opened up with, in your backstory. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for letting me go down that bunny trail.
Yeah. No, and that's why my book starts with chapter 1 is discovery, because I think it really starts with that. And the other piece of seeking before we move on is you've got to be really resourceful. So you have to think at the beginning, how am I going to get this done? And, having worked in the corporate world and in the last decade, spent a lot of time working with founders, helped me really reframe what resources you really need to get something off the ground. And so I think thinking about that early on is another part of seeking that's really important. So do you want to move on to seeding?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So seeding is really about prototyping, testing, learning, and how do you iterate rapidly get to get validation, then you're on to something. But I think it's really about doing. It's not about PowerPoints. It's not about imagining. It's the Nike slogan, just do it, or you're not going to get any place. And I point out to my clients, and I think this is something my teams in the corporate world were really good at. It's not just prototyping to see can we get to a product that functionally works, but also starting to imagine, well, how am I going to operationalize this? What is it going to take across the organization to get scale? And the sooner you start to think about and anticipate that, it opens up all kinds of realizations about how are you going to get from a successful test to, if that works, scaling. And if you only focus on product functionality, you're going to lose time. And speed becomes so essential that that I don't like to do that. So really thinking not just about functionality, but to have line of sight or reasonable hypotheses about your business model. And that becomes, because also working with founders, I really see that break down, all too frequently, that they've got something that technically works, but no foresight about the business model.
I see this all the time. It's so important. But, this is about seeing around corners while you're, I love the focus on the business model too, as a part of this. I think that's often skipped. Even with established companies, I find sometimes when I come in and work with teams, the team themselves isn't familiar with the company's business model, and it gets them in trouble.
I think there's too many people and really smart, successful, highly educated people who don't have a deep enough sense of how their company makes money and what really drives the business. So you have a top level sense of, well, we have revenues and we have expenses and we have capital, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But really get into what are the drivers of the P&L and the balance sheet. And I think one of the breakthroughs that really helped my team, and this was back at Citi, but it was a learning that I've applied ever since, is you have to get a deep focus on the drivers of the business model and then test and experiment around how you can move those drivers. So, if you're looking at new customer acquisition, in the credit card business, it's how many cards do we bring in? What are the quality of those cards? What's the cost to get the card? What channel are they coming in through? Because that could well affect credit quality. So it's really getting into all of those drivers. And if you understand those, you have to have them in your mind as you're testing and experimenting, but also you will have a lot more credibility with your colleagues and your management.
Absolutely. Well, and it makes a huge difference too in being able to measure the success of your innovation initiative too, because what you're doing is directly tying to what matters to the business.
Yeah, and I think metrics is a whole other issue that I teach a whole class on metrics in my course at Columbia, and it was not easy to break through to my students as bright as they are. I'm like, why this is so important, but I see a major innovation killer as when the team driving the innovation is held accountable to the traditional business metrics. So, classic, but I'm sure you've seen this too in your work. Team is all excited about some customer insight they've uncovered, and they have a concept that they want to try to develop, and they may have a prototype and a hypothetical P&L, and they go to the CFO team, and they're so excited, and the CFO goes, well, what's the ROI? And how can you possibly know? I mean, I think a lot of the early experimentation, the more disruptive the concept, the more likely it is you have no idea. And the whole point of your initial test and learn is to understand what are the drivers and what are appropriate measurements to apply to this. So you have to be very courageous about your metrics and how you have that conversation and kind of stick to your guns about developing metrics that are sort of fit for the purpose of innovation.
Yeah, that is so key. I think often about a long time ago, I was working with a gentleman who had a 4-year-old son, and he used to come to work and joke about the things that his son was saying. And he's like, yeah, now he's saying, Dad, I can't know that. Dad, I can't know that. And I'm like, innovation is like that sometimes. There are things that you just can't know up front, and you can't know them until you go through the process of doing the things that you need to do so that you can learn and discover.
Absolutely. And I think, the way to manage that in a resource constrained environment where, it's often a zero-sum game around who gets the resources is to figure out the smallest experiment, the smallest investment you need to make for the next proof point, and to work very, very iteratively. I don't like the phrase fail fast, fail cheap, because I don't like thinking about failure. I like thinking about learning, but you have to iterate in very, very small bite-sized pieces so that you're able to keep moving.
Yeah.
And so you need a lot of discipline around, well, what do I need to learn next and next and next and next? And really, that's how founders work.
Absolutely. Yes. I love that. We at TomorrowZone, we always, instead of saying fail forward fast, we say think big, start small, learn forward fast.
I like that much
and everything
better.
we do is learning.
I like that much better. And unfortunately, a lot of cultures, people may say failure is learning, but in reality, there is a lot of fear of failure. We're conditioned from elementary school. Raise your hand, give the answer, get it right, you get a gold star. And so you've got decades of educational conditioning to counteract.
Well, and then you get into business, and in certain instances, the stakes are pretty high when it comes to failure. And so, can see that aversion. But, you mentioned something earlier. You mentioned discipline in the innovation process. And I wanted to kind of talk about innovation within organizations. And one of the things that I know that many of our listeners may struggle with is just that innovation process of getting buy-in for those new ideas. You mentioned we've got a great idea, and then you go to the CFO or other executives who become kind of the committee of no, and then you have deflated people. But many struggle to get buy-in, or they don't know how to sell those ideas in a way that they can get traction. So they start to feel kind of isolated and alone in those change efforts. But what would you recommend for those change agents who really want to help bring others along, especially when, teams might be just tired from so much change or resource constrained, or they're feeling skeptical? What would you recommend in those cases?
Yeah, this is something we talk about a lot in my course at Columbia, this whole notion of strategic advocacy. And I think there's a couple of things you can do that are very practical with pencil and paper. Create what social activists would call a spectrum of allies. So think about who are your active allies, who are your passive allies, who's neutral, who are your passive resistors, and who are your active resistors. And sort of draw that spectrum. And a lot of people, our tendency is, may be, well, I'm going to go and overcome the resistors. And it's like, no. What you want to do is build momentum with your active allies and have them achieve the progress. And you will start to move some of the passive allies into your camp. So it's kind of the early adoption curve. Think about that. So you've got to find the people who are like the army of the willing who want to work with you. On the other hand, on the resistor side, what you want to do is listen to understand. Where is their resistance coming from? Are they afraid of the personal consequences of being associated with a failure? Or maybe they're actually seeing something that you've got to take into consideration and get to the bottom of. So there's a lot of reasons why people resist. And so I think it's build momentum, make your spectrum of allies, build momentum with your active allies, and build understanding with your resistors. What you don't want to do is go and announce to the world, this is what we're doing, because you're going to fuel your resistance, and that will demoralize your active allies. So it's being, again, having a discipline to that. And, at the bottom of it, the more you're able to build trust relationships across the spectrum, which is an everyday activity and commitment that has to be authentic, the more you do that, the more you will establish goodwill that you need for people to want to come along with you for the ride.
That is just brilliant. I haven't
Easy
heard it explained that way
easy
before.
To say, hard to do.
Well, it is hard to do because we think we can just focus on all the technicalities, but you have to work continually on building those relationships to be able to, get people to buy into your idea. I also love the way that you're framing resistance. It's not, it's not the enemy. It's kind of information.
It's information and it's insight. And if you're doing something that's truly innovative, you're just not going to win everybody over. And so don't set that as a goal. Say, I need enough active support to start to make progress on my testing and experimentation iterations, so that I can get to whatever the next goal is. And so you want to focus on that and keep them morale up, recognize their successes. You have to really invest there. But at the same time, you can't just spend time on the technicalities and the operational details. You've got to allocate some time every day and every week to understanding across your stakeholder spectrum. How are you building relationships and building trust and making sure that you're listening to people across the board, not necessarily with the agenda to convince them, but really to authentically listen and understand.
I love that. So I wanted to ask you, what is it that the great innovation leaders do differently to inspire teams and create a culture where people can contribute once they've gotten traction on this vision?
Yeah, I think they build diverse teams. So they bring people together who are bringing different skills and mindsets to the table. I always tell people, you don't want your innovation team to be 100% of me. You want, I've always tried and I wouldn't necessarily call myself a great innovation leader. I'm an experienced one, and I've learned from my successes and my not so successes. But I've always tried to surround myself with people who are different than me, because the harder the problem is that you're trying to solve, the more you will benefit from diversity of thought and life experience. I think that's one thing. And then secondly, create a culture within your team where there's very high psychological safety, and really focus on what does that look like. Are you, thinking about how do you recognize success for this type of team that may not be able to end the year with performance reviews that claim huge financial contribution? So what does success look for that team? And are you celebrating their successes and also their learnings? I think those are two of the things that are most important. And then work hard to remove barriers for them. So what are you doing as the leader to build coalitions across the organization that help your team succeed and help them move through the complexity of the organization? And you may have, as the leader of the group, you are likely the only one with the positional authority to influence having that kind of stuff happen.
You mentioned earlier that you work with startups, and I'm curious, What are some of the lessons that you've learned from the startup world that corporate leaders would benefit from hearing right now in this crazy world of uncertainty that we're facing?
Yeah, I think uncertainty has certainly become the watchword. I think, and it's funny, a few years ago, I was doing a presentation that's called What Startups and Big Companies Can Learn from Each Other.
Oh, cool.
Because sort of they both think, startups think that big companies are dinosaurs, and big companies think that startups have no accountability. And of course, neither is fully true. But I think certainly speed, action, action versus PowerPoint, speed versus kind of let's think about it some more. I think the really listening to your customers. Founders don't have $200,000 to go out and do a research study. They actually call their customers. So get FaceTime with talk directly to your customers. Don't be afraid of them. They like telling you what they think. So I think those are things that are all really important.
I'm like just taking it in because I'm dealing with these things right now. And it's funny, talk to customers is one of the things that often the tech people for our clients don't want to do. And it's the thing they need to do the most.
Oh, yeah. Or else whoever is, the marketing people or customer experience who's ever leading leading the initiative, they don't want to let the tech people out of the room.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's so important. And I think going back to, my first job experience, this was working behind the counter in my dad's store. I remember from where we used to be positioned behind the counter to the door, it was like 10 seconds. So and anybody could come through the door. You had like 10 seconds to sort of get your bearings and figure out, well, how am I going to work with this customer and solve their problem? And, you had to literally be on your feet. And I think having that skill is really important. I wish my dad passed away years ago. I wish I would thank him for it, because at the time I kind of hated having to go to work. Yeah, talking to your customers is probably the most important thing you can do.
Yeah, I think it's one of the most vital skills for the times that we're in, but also for where the world is going. And what a great opportunity that you had back then to be able to learn that on the job.
Yeah. And I think getting back to the uncertainty that we're all living with, it's going to become, I'm afraid, for some businesses, an excuse. We're not sure what's going to happen. So we have to pull back on innovation, when in fact, this is the most important time to be focusing on where do we go, because customers and users are going to be rethinking, what am I going to do with my money? They're going to be looking for all kinds of new help. They're going to be making different kinds of decisions. So lots of things are going to be in play that can spell opportunity. And it does not really have to cost money to go speak with your customers.
Yeah.
So you don't have budget reductions as an excuse.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important reminder. Amy, where can listeners learn more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, definitely my website, amyradin.com, RADIN, and where you can learn all about me. All of my articles are posted, my services, my speaking, everything's there. I have a YouTube channel, also Amy Radin, and my book, The Changemakers Playbook, How to Seek, Seed, and Scale Innovation in Any Company. Social media, I'm on LinkedIn 3 or 4 times a week, and love engaging with people who enjoy my content. So Lots of ways to find me.
Well, I do have your book, and I've just started it, so I'm really looking forward to diving into it. I think that your insights are just brilliant. I have one final question for you, and this is something that I've been asking people now for several years, and it's been interesting the types of responses that we get as our context continually shifts today. What is one thing that leaders could do today to shape a more awesome future?
I think this idea of understanding your spectrum of allies. and thinking about the actions and understanding that that spectrum is dynamic. But I think understanding your spectrum of allies and building momentum with the active allies and listening to understand insights from your resistors. I think that's practical. I said, doesn't cost anything and you can do it immediately.
Love it. That was brilliant. Amy, thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
Really fun to talk to you. I really, really enjoyed the conversation. You're bringing back a lot of memories. So thank you.
You're generating a lot of ideas. My brain is going. I'm kind of brain on fire now. So yeah, it's been awesome talking with you. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to subscribe, share it with a colleague who could benefit from these insights. And I just want to encourage you to keep exploring the art of the possible. Until next time, stay curious and choose to make awesome happen.